Welcome back to my series looking back on the 1900s. In part 4 now, we are going to be talking about a very old, outdated concept called friendship. You see, back in the ancient steel age of the 1900s, there was no social media because there was no cell phones. So back then, we actually had social lives and friendships, which cell phones and social media have completely destroyed, isolating everyone. Sure, the first cell phones did come out in the 90s, but almost no one had them, and the people who did barely used them. They were really just for emergencies or, quick information exchanges, as they cost like $4 per minute to use, and most people would just as soon get to a landline. What is a landline, you ask? A landline was a phone that was wired into a wall, which meant you had to stay stuck there while you talked on it. The cords could get long enough for you to be able to wander around the room if you wanted, and eventually cordless phones did come out. But you see, people didn't use phones the same way we did today, having their whole entire social lives take place on them. No, they used phones just to talk to people when they couldn't do so in person. And usually they were using them to make plans to get together to socialize in person, which is how much of our phone calls used to end. So it was okay that phones were attached to a wall and couldn't go anywhere with us because we didn't need or want them to, as we had no desire to spend all day on them. Especially since the people who we talked to on them, we were usually going to go meet up with and spend time with soon after. And another big difference between the phones back then and those today is that back then, of course, they didn't have texting. So you always had to actually call someone up and have a verbal conversation with them, which meant that back in those days, there really were no antisocial loners living in isolation like so many of us are today, almost everyone, in fact. It just wasn't possible to go without talking to others verbally on a daily basis, especially since not everyone had answering machines or voicemail either. And when you did, you had to actually call people back. Otherwise, they would probably call you back. And when you called people, since you were calling them on a home phone, the person who answered usually wouldn't even be the person you were calling for. You would have to ask for them, you see. You'd say, "Is so-and-so there?" And if they were, the person who had answered wouldn't just hand them the phone. They'd usually say, "Who's calling, please?" So that they could tell the person you were calling for who you were, in case that person didn't want to talk to you, in which case they'd say they were unavailable. And when you told them who you were, if they knew who you were, they'd tell you who they were, and they'd say hi and ask how you were doing, and you would exchange social niceties, another foreign concept today. You see, everyone was very social and polite back then. And if the person you were calling for wasn't there, then they would ask you if you would like to leave them a message. And you would tell them the business you wanted to discuss with your contact. And unless they were a really rude asshole, they would actually write it down and leave a note for this person. And so this would always happen. It didn't matter who you were calling. If you were calling someone who you had a crush on and were super nervous about talking to and were planning on asking out, it just didn't matter. Usually the first people you talked to were always their family, which only made it more nerve-wracking, but that was good for us. You see, it forced us to be social and to develop certain social confidence and skills, which also helped us to build character strengths. And then, whenever you went over to their house to meet their family for the first time, it wasn't a big deal because you had already spoken to them all over the phone. Not conversationally, of course, but you at least knew each other's voices and names already. And so meeting them in person felt much more natural. These days, people get caught up in these texting stages, and they may not even know the voice of their own love interests for some time, making the first phone call get so built up that it causes so much anxiety. Sometimes you never even get around to it before you've ghosted one another. And if you do actually start dating the person, then going over to their house and doing things like meeting a family member seem like momentous occasions. And our lack of social skills due to our lack of practice and experience make it feel like so much bigger of a deal than it should be, than it ever was before. We are so antisocial these days due to the cell phone and mainly the texting and social media that we do on them. Because of those two things, we are no longer doing what we used to do socially in a very common and everyday practice back in the 1900s and earlier, which is to actually get together and see people in person and hang out with one another. These days, however, we spend most of our social lives typing out short little pathetic excuses for sentences in improper English with minced up words on a tiny little keyboard with tiny little buttons, which takes an awful long time to say so little and so poorly. Very little real communication is taking place. And that's in spite of the fact that people could be using this technology to improve communication and actually be calling each other quite easily, and not just with phone, but video too, which would be important for better communication. Or if they don't have time to actually call, they could, instead of mashing these tiny little keys into shitty sentences, that barely even qualify as sentences, they could just press a record button and record a short little voice message. Either of which would greatly enhance communication, because so much of communication is nonverbal, right? So it is very important that communication actually take place in person, or if it can't, that it be done via video call instead of just a phone call or especially a text message, if possible. But if a call's not possible, then it would be very important to use voice messaging, since so much about communication relies upon things such as tone and not just words, right? And when you're texting, you're using words very poorly. Like I said, these sentences barely qualify as sentences. You're mincing up the English language, using improper English as if you're a foreigner who doesn't even speak it as their native language, right? And yet it would be so much easier to just press the record button and then record a voice message where you can actually communicate verbally quite easily and be communicating more effectively. But for some reason, people are spending $1,000 on phones that are priced that high because they are supposed to be the greatest communication technology ever. And yet, they aren't even using the technology they paid for to communicate effectively, but are choosing to do so in the most difficult method possible, by texting, which is only miscommunicating and not having a real social life, especially since they also aren't using their communication devices to schedule meetups with people and actually get together and be social in the real world. But back in the good old days, we spent most of our social lives getting together in person with people and hanging out, in spite of the fact that we could, actually call them up with our home phones. We got together where we could have much more comprehensive communication than is being done today. Since so much communication occurs through body language, and hanging out, spending time together with people is so much more enjoyable and satisfying. It's just so much more fun to communicate in person with people, where you can actually do fun activities together and even go on adventures together. Or you could just chill out and have really long, in-depth group conversations that are not possible on phones or online. And that way you can develop real meaningful friendships. And there's no substitute for this stuff online, right? Social media groups are not a substitute for hanging out with groups in person. Even these group Zoom calls aren't a substitute, because in spite of the fact that you have video and can see each other, you can't have the same group dynamics and conversations as you can, because people have to really talk one at a time in these Zoom meetings. And, if you interrupt, it doesn't work out, right? And that's just part of being social, is being able to interject and have this highly stimulated, multifaceted communication where, everyone is jumping in to contribute at different times, right? It's so stimulating, right? And we would do things like getting together after school or work at popular local spots such as town squares, parks, arcades, malls, bowling alleys, record shops, cafes, bars, or just street corners, wherever. Me and my friends, we would get together at parks and smoke weed, and that was back when it was illegal, so it was like only the badasses did it, right? And we would play guitar sometimes at these parks. It was really idyllic doing that in the nature setting like that. Or we would go hiking and have like these nature adventures. Or we would get together at each other's apartments to, make food, eat and drink, and then maybe watch movies together and talk about them, or play cards. And, it didn't really even have to be anywhere special. The important thing was that you were getting together as friends. It didn't matter so much what you were doing or where. Back in those days when you would actually hang out with your friends, even if you wouldn't go out and do anything important, you could just spend the entire day or night having intellectual, philosophical conversations that would be very fulfilling. For instance, about a movie you watched together that was very thought-provoking, or a new favorite album that was very creative and inspiring, or whatever meanings you were assigning to life at that time. It was through these chill sessions and the deep, meaningful conversations we would have in them that real emotional intimacy was developed and true bonds were formed. That's why back in those days, people had groups of friends and even best friends who they knew most and felt like there was a real understanding and empathy between them. Something that is simply not possible today due to people only relating to each other through the matrix of cell phones, which cuts off all sense of humanity and connectedness between us and has completely replaced our social lives with screens. So, of course, no one has any real friends anymore. They also cannot have anything even more intimate than that, such as romance or love, which is what I'm going to get into next in the 5th installment of this series. So, if you enjoyed this, watch out for that next one and make sure that your subscription is set to all so that you'll be notified when it comes out. Or you can check the description box below to see if I have posted it yet. And be sure to check out my other videos in the videos section. And otherwise, I will talk to you guys more then.